Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Paul. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. It is great to be here. It's always great to be home. It just feels like I'm home. The last few times that I had the privilege of preaching here at Parkland, I usually end up in tears at some point in the message, just because when you come home, you cry. At least that's what we do in our family. And so I'll try not to cry this morning, but inevitably it always happens at some point. So I'm just giving you that warning this morning. But it does feel so good to be home. And I want to echo what Tanya shared, just that huge thank you of Parkland support for us in the ministry. Parkland has played a significant, and I can't even probably have the right adjective to describe the significant role that that's taken place in Romania and the growth and the development of the camp. And it goes back decades. You know, George and Arliss were one of the first ever from Canada to head over to Romania, to this small little village, to meet a pastor who had 12 or 13 churches at that time. And that was just began this incredible ministry that's now taking place 35 years later. And shortly after that trip, George and Arliss, along with Parkland Baptist in the year 2000, decided, let's send a team to Romania, which was the first mission team, one of the first, I believe, that ever went from the NAB and from this region. You know, it was interesting, Tanya and I have had the privilege of hosting many NAB missionaries or mission teams in the last 11 years of us being there. I was doing the math not that long ago, and I believe we've hosted close to or over 50 different mission teams that have come in 11 years, which would be close to 500 people over those 11 years. The first mission team that ever went prior to us being missionaries was Parkland Baptist Church that sent a team. You started that, which is remarkable. I gave you the warning. I said I was going to cry. You started that, and that's remarkable to think about. And so thank you for that. And so today, as Tanya said, is a celebration of all that God's done over these years and that he hasn't stopped doing, that he's continuing to do. And as much as we celebrate today, we're celebrating for the future as well as what's going to take place. So thank you for being such key partners in that ministry. This morning, I'll share a few more stories about Romania as we make our way through this passage, but I want us to open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. We're entering this season of Christmas and the season of Advent. And it's remarkable as we think about this season of Advent. If you know Advent is this idea of waiting. We're waiting for something. Certainly as we think about in the sense of Scripture, they were waiting for the Messiah to come. That's why we read such beautiful passages in the prophets of them waiting for the Messiah, looking ahead, not knowing when he was going to come, but that he would come at some point and save the people of Israel. And now, knowing what Jesus has done for us, we're awaiting his return. And that's the season of Advent. And so Advent often, not only is it the season of waiting, but it's the season of fulfillment, that Jesus comes and fulfills something. And so I want us to look at the life of Jesus a little bit as this fulfillment of what he's done in our midst. And so Matthew 7, verses 28 and 29, I just want to read two verses, and then we're going to look at a couple chapters really quickly together. But in Matthew 7, verse 28, now just the context of this, Jesus has just preached probably one of the most profound sermons that have ever been preached. He has just preached the Sermon on the Mount, so there's huge crowds there. They've been listening to Jesus preach. And they say, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So Jesus has just preached a sermon, and they stand back and they're like, this man has preached a sermon that we've never heard before, and he's preaching this sermon in a way, an authoritative way that we've never heard before. Now, this word authority, I want us to think about a little bit this morning. And the Greek word, do we have any Greek speakers here this morning? Perfect, good. You won't correct my pronunciation of it then. The Greek word here that I want us to kind of look at for a moment actually gives us a deeper understanding of what this word authority means. And the Greek word is exousia. Everybody say that with me. Exousia. That was good. Okay. We're going to say that word a couple times this morning because it's going to come up. It's going to be the theme of this morning, and theme of actually Matthew. He's trying to pull this theme out for us to see because it's going to come up in the next few chapters. This word authority has more of a holistic, bigger picture. And it's kind of like this. I want to tell you a story that maybe kind of gives us an idea of this. Now, this is one of those stories that didn't ever hit the newsletter of living in Romania. Missionaries all have those stories. So I'm going to tell you a story that hopefully you won't share broader than this room. It's kind of a secret story. So hopefully it doesn't make it online. It's fine if it does. But don't tell anybody. But one time I was going to the border in Romania. And so Romania is right on the border of Hungary. We'd often go to Hungary to pick up our North American teams when they'd come in. So we'd go through the border all the time. And one time I was traveling from Romania to Hungary, and I get stopped at the border. And the Hungarian border guard said, "You're not coming to Hungary today." I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "I don't like your driver's license." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" Now, I'll admit he was wrong, I was right, but that doesn't matter sometimes when you talk to authorities. And he said, "No, your driver's license isn't good, so I can't let you in the country." And I said, "Well, I need to get in there." And he's like, "No, I'm not letting you in." And I kind of had that feeling that whether I argued with him for 10 minutes or an hour, the answer was still going to be no. So an hour and a half later, it was still no. And so he said, "No, go back to Romania." And so I turn around, I go back to Romania. I'm like, "Man, what am I going to do? We got to go pick up this team." And I knew of another border crossing 20, 30 minutes later. I was like, "Well, I'll go there. Maybe they'll let me in." So I go to the next border. So I go to the next border, and I'm in line, and I'm thinking, "Man, I really got to get in. And if I get turned away at this border, then how am I going to get into the country today?" And I saw behind me a car, and that car had 3 or 4 guys in it. And I was like, "Oh, I bet you one of them could drive me across the border." Because my passport's fine, it's just he didn't like my driver's license, which again, it was fine. I wasn't doing anything illegal. And so I get up out of my car as I'm in line at the border, and I knock on the door of the car behind me. I said, "Hey, does anyone want to drive my car across the border?" So you all know the answer to that question is no. You say no if anybody ever asks you that question. Children, youth, you say no to that. That's how you end up in jail for life. You never drive someone else's car across the border. This guy said yes. And I was like, "Oh, thank you." So he jumped in the car, and I jumped in the car, and we became friends in the 20-minute border line, and we went through the border, and it was fine, and I could carry on with my day. But it begs the question of authority. It begs the question of the responsibility of this border guard as he stops me. And there's kind of 3 things to his authority that he carried out. And all of these 3 things actually is within this word exousia of the Greek word that Matthew is trying to get at. The first thing is the permission. So there's actually permission given for this type of authority. So when this border guard stops me, whether he's right or wrong, he has been given permission from the Hungarian government to stop people, to stop really dangerous Canadians. That was the permission he was given by the Hungarian authorities. Now, the second thing is he was given responsibility. That it actually is his responsibility to stop me. Now, if you did have dangerous people come to the border, which I'm sure they do see from time to time, that's his responsibility. So not only is he being given that permission, it's his responsibility to stop somebody. Now, the third piece of that is ability. He actually has the ability to stop me. Now, if I was like, "Well, you're wrong, I'm just going to carry on with my way," he had a gun. He could stop me. I didn't really want to test that. So he has the permission to do this. He has the responsibility, but he also has the ability. Now, when we meet Jesus here, and this idea of authority in the Greek word, what is it? Exousia, good work. That's what it's speaking to, the permission, the ability, and the responsibility that Jesus comes on the scene as the fulfillment of this Messiah, having the permission to carry this authority, having the responsibility to carry this authority, and actually having the ability to carry on this authority. And I want us just really quickly to see this in the next few chapters in Matthew. So keep your Bibles open. We're going to go through really quickly. I want us to see this authority working itself out in Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 8, right away, right after this theme has come up, a man comes to Jesus who's sick. And that man is sick with a skin disease, and he has leprosy. And he says, "Lord, if you will," basically saying, if you have the ability, if you have the exousia, can you make me clean? And what does Jesus do? What does he say? He says, "Yes, I have that ability. I can do that." He touches him. He heals him. Jesus has the authority over sickness and over the body. Right after that, a centurion comes to Jesus. Now, a centurion was a man who had authority. This idea comes up actually a few times. This word exousia is seen in this passage when the centurion comes to him and says, hey, I too am a man with exousia. I have this authority. Many people report to me, and Jesus, I see that you also have this exousia. I have a servant who's paralyzed. Can you heal him? And Jesus says, yes, I can. And he heals that paralyzed servant. So again, Jesus has this exousia, this authority over sickness and broken body. A few stories later, as we get into verses 23 to 27 of chapter 8, there's this profound moment where Jesus is with the disciples on the boat, and the winds and the waves come up, and the disciples are really afraid because they're going to die. They're going to sink. Their boat's going to sink. And they say, Jesus, we're going to die. We're perishing. Save us. And Jesus says, why are you so afraid? And what does he do? He calms the wind and the waves and the storm. Jesus has the authority over creation. And then right after they get off the boat, there's two men who are demon possessed. And nobody can heal them. Nobody knows what to do with them. Jesus goes up and he heals them. Jesus has authority over darkness. And then the next story, right after that, as we get into chapter 9, another paralyzed man comes to Jesus. Now, this one's story is a little bit different, because rather than Jesus just saying, you're healed, what does he say? Your sins are forgiven. Jesus says, I can forgive your sins. Now, let's stop for a moment. This causes a stir. The Pharisees are not happy about this. And basically they ask Jesus, who's given you that authority? They say in verse 3, this man is blaspheming, essentially saying, who's giving you that exousia? Who's given you that responsibility? Who's given you that permission to be able to forgive sins? Who's given you that ability to do that? And what does Jesus say to them? He says in verse 6, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority, again that word exousia, on earth to forgive sins. That's been given to him by something or someone. And he can do that. And so now Jesus not only displays his authority over the leprous, over the nature, over the darkness, over the demons, over sin. There's one last story right at the end, or as we're getting close to the end of chapter 9, where a little girl is dying. And the father comes to Jesus and says, come, heal my daughter. And by the time Jesus gets to where this little girl is, she's died and the funeral has started and the music is playing. And Jesus says, stop the funeral. And they try and get Jesus out of there. They're like, no, it's okay. She's dead already. Jesus says, no, stop. And he touches the girl and he takes her from this place of death to this place of life. Jesus has this authority even over death. And so this is a remarkable progression as we see Jesus have this authority from just over the body to then over creation, to then over darkness and sin, and then to over death. And you'd say, what else can Jesus do? Like, what other things can he do to display this authority? And I'll tell you that there's only one other thing that he's going to do that's going to be more remarkable than these things, and that's rise from the dead, which is going to happen a little bit later. But you wonder that question, what's Jesus going to do next with this authority? And I don't know about you, but what would you do with this authority? Like, if I realized I had this type of authority, I'm pretty sure I would just head to the White House. Like, put me in charge. Give me all the power I can. Like, I think that's our normal response. But here's the remarkable thing about what Jesus does with this authority. And this is what I want us to sort of think about this morning for the next few minutes. In chapter 10, it says, and when he called to his 12 disciples, this is verse 1, and he called to him his 12 disciples, and what does he do? He gives them the authority. He gives them the exousia, same word used there. He gives them that authority. Now, I know this can get confusing and complicated in terms of, well, is that just for those disciples at that time? But these are the exact same words that Jesus speaks to the disciples a little bit later in Matthew 28, where he gives the Great Commission that we know is extended to the church, that says, all authority in heaven has been given to me. Now you go and make disciples of all nations. And that's the call for us. So what does Jesus do with that authority? He looks at each and every one of us in this room today, In the same way that he looked at each and every one of those disciples and he says, now you have that authority and go and live that out. That we're all disciples, that we're all missionaries. May that be in Spruce Grove, may that be in Romania, that call is for all of us. And that we carry this authority of the Lord in our lives. And I don't always know exactly how that works itself out theologically, but I just want to suggest 3 things for us this morning as we think about this in our own lives. That this authority that has been given from Jesus to us. I want us to look at this in 3 ways. Number 1, first thinking about that permission. This authority and the permission that's been given to us. Now, when we think about this idea of permission, I think often we think, hey, the more authority I have, the more freedom I have, right? If I've been given permission to something in authority, I have freedom to live this out. I remember when I was 16 and I got my driver's license, more authority, more freedom. I felt like I could go to McDonald's anytime I want. No, I didn't have to get permission on that one. I could go. There's freedom in that permission. In our household, I don't know if this was like a stated rule or law or if it just happened, but when we hit 18, there really was no curfew anymore. Now, I'm not saying parents that's what you have to do or institute by any means. That's not biblical. Now, I think my parents are awesome parents, so they could write a book on parenting. But in our house, it was kind of you got to the age of 18, we had the responsibility, the authority, we could stay out as long as we want. The most rebellious I got on that is we'd stay out till like 2 or 3 in the morning playing floor hockey at the church, So that's how rebellious we were on that one. But usually there's a sense of, okay, I've been given authority, I've been given power, that means freedom. The remarkable thing about the way that Jesus lives this out is the permission that's been given to him within this authority actually leads to a deeper level of submission. That's the remarkable thing. This authority that's been given to us should lead us to a deeper level of submission. There's this remarkable relationship between the Father and the Son as Jesus is living that out. And multiple times in the book of John, Jesus says, it's the Father who's given me this authority. It's the Father who's given me this authority. So he recognizes within the triune God, Jesus the Son has been given permission from the Father to live this out. Now, multiple times, what does Jesus then say with this authority or this permission that's been given to him? In John chapter 5, he says, I look to the Father in how to act. I look to the Father in how to act. In John 12, he says, I speak as the Father tells me to speak. In John 14, he says, I do as the Father commands me to. There's actually this deep level of submission that Jesus has in the authority that's been given to him. And the same for us. In this authority that's been given to us as disciples, it actually leads us to deeper levels of submission. Now, I would say that even as Tanya and I think about our time in Romania, I would say that that's the case. I believe I've shared this before, but even when we first were called to Romania, I fought that call. Not because I didn't want to go, but it didn't make sense to me that we would be called to Romania. And I fought that for 6 months to a year of just saying, Lord, I don't think we can go to Romania. I don't think we can go to Romania. And now I look back of serving in Romania for 11 years. There's nothing I would have rather have done. But there's a call to submission in that. And there's this beauty in submission because the Lord often knows our lives better than we know our own lives. And I would say even in this last season, Tanya and I got to the point of living in Romania for 8, 9, 10 years, and we kind of looked at each other and said, should we just live here the rest of our lives? Like, we love it here. We loved our lives. And we went to the Lord and we said, God, what are you calling us to into this next season? Like, do you want us to stay in Romania, and do we just accept that call to Romania forever? Or are you calling us into something new? And he began to clearly speak to us that he was calling us back to Canada. And I would say that took a level of submission. We wanted to stay. But the Lord worked at our heart, and there was this submission into that calling. So there's this beautiful submission in the authority that's been given to us. But there's also a level of responsibility. Jesus carried that responsibility. Again, as we see the Pharisees getting mad at Jesus saying, who's given you this responsibility to forgive sins? And we know what he's going to do on the cross. He had and carried that responsibility to forgive sins. Nobody could do what Jesus did in his death and in his resurrection. But there's this responsibility that's been given to us too in the sharing of the gospel and the spreading of the gospel. There's a story in Mark 13 where it talks about a man who goes away and comes back, and he leaves somebody in charge. And he leaves that servant in charge to care for this area that he has, or this responsibility that has. That word in charge is, again, that Greek word exousia, that authority, that this responsibility has been handed off. And that's the church in many respects, that as we read in the New Testament, we've been given the responsibility of the gospel. I remember one time my family went away on a short weekend vacation, and we had someone take care of our house while we were away. And I remember we got back a few hours early, and as we got into the house was just a disaster. It was really dirty, it was really messy. And the guy, a family friend who had been staying there to kind of care for the house, was there. And I remember all of us were saying, "What did you do? The house is really messy." And he's like, "Oh, I thought you were getting home later." And I'll never forget that response, because the reality is his responsibility for the house was not for the last hour, but it was for the entire time. It's a poor excuse. And I think that begs the question for us. We've been given this responsibility, not just for the last hour, but for our entire lives. And so this authority that's been given to the disciples, that authority that's been given to us, how are we living that out? It's been remarkable in Romania, I think, to see this lived out. And living there for an entire generation of young people kind of growing up into the ministry and attending camp programs. And Tanya shared a few of those stories, and we'll go share a few more this evening. But what's been remarkable is seeing those 12, 13, 14-year-olds, now mid-20s, taking on the ministry. Why? Because they feel this responsibility. We have a weekly Friday youth group, and who's running that? It's those young adults. Every week we have young adults who drive to our local Gypsy Roma village, pick up kids in the bus, and bring them back to run kids programs with them. Summer camps are being run by those young adults. Mission teams are being led by those young adults. And when you talk to them, even their own local church, they're serving in kids ministry and leading worship. And when you talk to them, they say, we're responsible for our people. We're responsible for the gospel. We've been transformed in our lives, and that's just what we have to do. There's one young guy by the name of Robbie, and Tanya talked about Robbie earlier, but Robbie grew up in our village and had a really difficult background. His dad left at a really, really young age. His mom's a wonderful lady, but really difficult for her in Romania context as a single mom to support a son and a daughter. And so Robbie at a very young age had to support his family, help support his family. They weren't connected to our church, but they'd come to our youth group. And I remember at the first summer camp we ever had at Camp Falcon Rock, Robbie came and he gave his life to the Lord. We had the opportunity to pray with him, and it was a beautiful moment. And then to support his family, he moved off to Hungary. And so he'd make a wage, send it back. But he was finding as he was living in Hungary, he was so disconnected to youth, and that was really hard for him. That was hard as he was disconnected from the youth group. And so he made that decision to move back to Romania. And as he came back to Romania, he found a job. He could support his family. He could attend youth weekly. And in the midst of that, felt a call to ministry and went to Bible school. And after that, came back and joined our team. And is also now transitioned as an NAB national missionary, which essentially means similar to Thomas and Tunda. They're from the country, they speak the language, and they join our team serving full-time there. And when you talk to Robbie about it, he would just say the exact same thing. He feels so called and responsible for not only what God's done in his life and the transformation he's experienced, but then that call to his own people. And so that begs the question in our lives: what are we responsible for, and what are we responsible to? And then lastly, and this is where I want to end this morning, but the authority and the ability, that we've actually been given the ability to serve him. Now, that's a remarkable thing, and Jesus actually says this in John as he looks at the disciples, when he says, and I don't get this, maybe Pastor Josh can speak to this at another time, and he's smarter than I am, but Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, you will do even greater things than I. And I don't fully understand that, but I certainly recognize that in the work of the Spirit in our lives, by the work of God, there's great things that can take place in the church. There's great things that can take place in our lives. And we've just seen that in Romania over and over again. And again, that all goes back to the work of God, that as Paul prays in Ephesians 3, that we will do immeasurably more than all we could ever ask, imagine, according to his power that's at work within us. God is on the move and he's doing great things. And I just attest to that, and we see that. This evening we'll show some more pictures of the before and after, but when I think about Camp Falcon Rock and where it is today, I'm just amazed at what God has done. You know, and I think this is one of the greatest objections that we have in serving the Lord. It's even working with youth, it's one of the greatest objections as you go up to a young person, like, hey, you're a great guitar player, why don't you come up and play on Sunday morning? And they'll be like, oh, I'm not good enough, right? That's the first thing they'll say. But the reality is, I think we all feel that. We have an opportunity to share the gospel with a friend or neighbor, and what's the first thing we think? I'm never going to have the right words. I'm not smart enough. You know, we have an opportunity to serve in church, and the first thing we think about is, I'm just not quite good enough. That ability piece is huge for us. And yet what I've seen over and over again, and even for me, I'll say, one of the major objections to moving to Romania was thinking, there's no way we can do this. There's no way we can do this. And yet we've seen God do it according to his power. And that's a remarkable thing. I remember one time a few years ago, we were building our main lodge, which you saw the video of this morning. And as we were building it, there was a piece of land that came up for sale. And all of our resources were going to the main lodge. And this piece of land came up. It was a piece of land that we had been asking a farmer about for years and years and years, and he never wanted to sell it. And then he finally did. And he said, I love what you guys are doing at camp. I'll sell you this piece of land. And we said, great, how much is it? And he said, $30,000. And we're like, great, we don't have $30,000. And so we talked as leaders and we said, you know, what should we do? And it was just felt like the Lord was leading us to go buy this piece of land, even though we certainly didn't have $30,000. And if we did, it would go to the main lodge because that's where all of our money was going in those days. But we just felt like the Lord was leading us in that direction. And that week, I got a phone call from someone from Canada, someone I hadn't called up. I wasn't initiating this. It was just out of the blue. And they called up and said, hey, what projects are you working on? And so I start listing all the projects we're working on. And I was about to hang up and I said, oh yeah, and then this piece of land is up for sale. And they're like, how much? And I said, $30,000. And they said, oh, we just sold a piece of land and we want to tithe off that $30,000. I'll send that to the camp. I mean, that's God. That's God, and we just saw that over and over again. But here's the remarkable thing. Not only does that happen at a physical level, and we saw that at a physical level, but we saw it at a spiritual level. And we're seeing it at a spiritual level at Camp Falcon Rock. This past summer, we had, this is the last story, I'll finish here, but we had one of our youth that we've been working with for a long time want to volunteer. Now, if you've ever served with youth, there's always a couple that are the most challenging. I was one of those, and this guy was one of those. And he always has been. And this is the first time he was really interested in volunteering. And so I was a little concerned, but our team on the ground said, no, let's get behind this guy. Let's build into his life. Let's bring him on staff. And so they brought him on staff, 17 years old, to assist in a cabin. And I remember this moment. And it was right at the end of the week, and we had this powerful campfire experience where so many kids came up and gave their lives to the Lord. And so much so that we as leaders were trying to figure out how do we get more leaders to kind of pray with each of these kids, not to leave them alone, because most of the kids were up front responding to the gospel message. And so we're scrambling the leaders to do that. And I remember looking at this one 17-year-old boy as he was going from one kid to the next praying with them. And that evening he had the opportunity to pray with 4 or 5 young kids as they gave their lives to the Lord. 17-year-old boy, one of our most challenging youth. And I'm like, man, if God can use him, he can use any of us. And God transformed his heart in that moment. And he just said, I'm on fire for the Lord, and he made the decision to get baptized in the fall. God's at work, and he's transforming lives, and that's his ability. And so we give him the thanks and the praise for that. And so it's been a privilege to serve together in ministry all these years, and so we thank you for that. And we look forward to what God has for us in the future. And we just say with confidence that the work in Romania is not ending now as we transition out. We actually believe the best days are ahead for Camp Falcon Rock. And we're so excited to see what God's going to do in that. So thank you for partnering with us in that. And we look forward to all that God will do in our lives here at Parkland and around the world. Amen.